Today is April 1st, 2014. Our session is being held at the Jewish Community Center in Stamford, Connecticut, and I am a member of a team at the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. We are participating in the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress. Our honoree today is Daniel Roberts, who was born July 25th, 1925. That means he'll be 89 in July.
No, July 1st, 1925.
Okay, we have it, okay.
Close.
Okay, so let's go to Dan, and we'll go from there.
Where do you want me to begin?
No, I'm going to ask.
You ask me the questions?
Yes.
I'll answer.
Okay. So Dan, thank you so much for participating with us today.
My pleasure.
We know you have a very interesting history, and we're recording you for posterity in the sense that one copy of this will be going to the Library of Congress, one copy you get, and the other copy of the DVD will be on file in Stamford at the Jewish Historical Society. Mm-hmm. So we're going to run you through sort of quickly your life stream and so forth. So to begin, tell us something about where you grew up, where your parents came, just some little bio and so forth.
My father came from Kiev in the Ukraine and came here in 1917. His father shipped them over because the Russians wanted to draft everybody, and the Russians were losing the war then. My mother came here in the year 2004 with my grandmother to get again out of the, I forget what to say, a Jewish enclave that was set up by the Tsar. And my whole family then came here to the United States. My parents were married in 1924, and I was born July 1st, 1925, and I have one sister who was 5 years younger than me. When we came here, well, I was born in East New York, and then we moved into Brooklyn, further down. I grew up primarily in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. And while I was there, forgetting high school, junior high school and all, I was admitted after taking an exam to the Brooklyn Technical High School, considered then one of the finest of three superb high schools in New York City: Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, and
Science,
and the Bronx High School of Science.
Okay, can we just back up a minute?
Yes.
When your parents came over here, and before you started high school and so forth, what kind of business was your father in, or your mother?
My father opened a tiny little store on 3rd Avenue as a print shop with one employee. However, when the Depression hit, he had no business, and he spent the rest of his life as a typesetter in New York City for, I think, $25 a week, rent. Eventually, first we lived in a small little apartment, 2 rooms. My sister, I, and my parents lived in 1 bedroom, and we had 1 big living room with a built-in kitchen in the wall and a john at the other end. Then eventually my father, we moved up into a 2-family home on the 2nd floor, and that's where I spent most of my growing up days. And from there I commuted by train every day to the Brooklyn Technical High School, downtown Brooklyn. And there I went into the aeronautical course because I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. The thing that set me on my path was the World's Fair of 1939, because there I saw another world opening up, but I won't go into the details. Anybody can probably see this on the internet. When I graduated Brooklyn Tech, I was 17 and a half or something like that. I got a job as a draftsman at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and I worked there designing different parts of a ship. But while I was there, I heard about a special program called the Army Specialized Training Program, better known as the ASTP. I took the exam, I passed it, and on my birthday, my 18th birthday, I get a little notice in the mail, "Hi, you're welcoming you into the Army." And eventually I wound up, as everyone was required to do, going through basic infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia. During the process of that, I was interviewed through ASTP, and I was assigned to Princeton University to study engineering, and I thought, my God, this is the best thing ever happened to me. And that was in January of 1944. Unfortunately, the program throughout the country was closed at the end of March of 1944. They eliminated everybody, and with no choices, we were all put into the infantry, whether we liked it or not. My class at Princeton went to the 104th Infantry Division at Camp Carson, Colorado.
Can we stop there, just back
Yes.
up? Because I know we're going to, next step, we're going to move to your overseas duty and so on.
Okay.
So let's talk about your early days in the Army. In effect, you enlisted, right?
I enlisted.
And you're in the Army. And what were your experiences in the Army before you went overseas? Basic training and so forth?
Basic training was at Fort Benning, Georgia for whatever the period of time, several weeks, and everybody was required to take that process. And while I was there, I was interviewed for ASTP because I was also part of the program. And fortunately, I was assigned to Princeton University to study engineering. That began in January of 1944, but unfortunately, by the end of March, they closed the program throughout the country, and then we were all, for my group, sent to Camp Carson, Colorado to join the 104th Infantry Division.
Now, how did you find basic training?
How did I find training? Very hot, because this was in July of 1943. So, yeah, 1943. It was hot as hell down there. Did I like it? Nobody did, but we got up around 5:30 in the morning, went out, lined up, and then next day physical exercise, and part of it was also, well, other parts there. Well, basic training is basic training. How to shoot a gun, an exercise to do. I can't remember the details of basic training, but it was no fun.
Yeah. To what extent did you interact with the Jewish community around Fort Benning, Georgia?
I never knew there was such a thing in Fort Benning, Georgia. Not at all. We had a few Jews in my group as friends, but that was about it. Growing up in Brooklyn, I had a big group of friends. Big group. We had a lovely time together, and we met a whole group of girls, and the girls and we had parties and everything else. But that's the summary of it very rapidly.
Okay, so
then I went to Princeton University, as I said. I was there only for 3 months. The promise was, you finish this, you go to officers' candidate school, etc., and you'll be an officer in the Army, what have you. My object was to study aeronautics and to get into the Air Force, but when they closed the program, nobody had any choices. Sir, you are going into the infantry, whether you like it or not. Didn't like it, but that's what happened.
Okay, so let's go back to Camp Carson. And you're back in the infantry?
In the infantry.
Okay, so take us from there.
Okay, this was an old infantry division. We were a bunch of young kids coming from college, and we were considered, quote, the smart asses, because we asked the questions. But whatever. In September of 1944. The invasion on D-Day was in June. And our group landed on the same beaches, Utah Beach, on September 8th, 1944. Our first function then was to those who could drive, joined, I forget what it's called, the drive trucks to the front. There's a name for those trucks, but I can't remember them. Since I didn't drive then, we were then assigned to go with the supply trains into bring them up north or to the war zone. Our group got as far as Paris, and then the next day we came back in Paris, which had only been liberated about 2 months before. It was still under blackout, but there was a USO. At the USO, we were invited by a very wonderful by a woman to have dinner at our house. The next morning we came all the way back to our division, and from there we got on some trucks, and we were told we were going into Belgium. The object of this change, we joined the Canadian Army, was to prevent the Germans from getting the port of Antwerp, which was going to be the second supply base for the troops in Germany. The first one was in France. I can't remember the name now.
Let's back up just a minute again. Okay, so you landed on Utah Beach.
Yes.
The conflict there was over. And what period of time are we talking about getting from Utah Beach to Paris?
Oh, just a couple of days. But when we landed, we saw all the remnants of the D-Day excursion there with the everything sticking up out of the water and broken up. Well, it was a horrible situation. And then in a couple of days, we're all assigned in our group, I'd say we guarded the supply trains to the front. The other group drove trucks called the Red Ball Express. Now I remember it. Those who could drive, who had licenses, joined the Red Ball Express. But that didn't last very long before we were all brought back together onto trucks and up into Belgium to join the Canadian Army, as I may have mentioned. And the purpose there was to prevent the Germans from getting the port of Antwerp, which would be the second supply base. That was one of my first experiences of almost getting killed 3 times. The first time was when my friend and I were digging foxholes and putting the dirt in between us. And we don't know whether it was from us or the Germans, but we had a big explosion right next to us, and my ears started to ring, and they missed us. And then we continued on into Belgium and into Holland. And in Holland, well, the thing that was most sensitive is that we went to a small farming village. I used to remember the name of it. At my age, I'm going to be 89, I can't remember the name of this village. But all the residents came out and were hugging us and bringing us candy and bringing us whatever we wanted to as we walked through this little farming village. Then we all had to go out, and it was starting to rain, getting dark, dig foxholes, get down. But since it was pouring and the foxholes were muddy, the smart ass, said I got to get something to cover this little foxhole with. And so I went ahead, and this was at a farmer's yard. I was starting to get with we all had a little shovel to remove some wood from the fence of the farmer. And as I was doing that, a German machine gun shot at me and missed me, must be by a couple of inches, because I heard the bullets going right by my ears. I said, the hell with the wood. I went into the foxhole, and we got soaked that night. Then from there,
Had you, by this time, already been in combat situations?
this is with the start of the combat situation.
And you
Right.
had fired your weapon?
Yeah, and that's where that began. And from there, we continued on, and we were in some fights. And the Germans had what they call the 88s. These were the Tiger tanks. And one of them must have been hit by us. And we captured 4 German soldiers, or tankers. And one of them is where I got my souvenir here. I took off his armband and the medals that were on it. And that became part of my archives. Put it away in my backpack or whatever. Then as we continued on into Holland, Holland, as you may know, is full of dikes. We had to cross a little stream. The engineering battalion came up with metal rowboats, and we had to cross the stream. As we're crossing the stream, the Germans were shooting straight down the stream and missed us. And then we climbed back and we climbed onto the dikes there and moved forward into some fighting situations. And then at a point, we were all pulled back and put on trucks and moved into Germany. In Germany, you may have heard of what they call the, what's the Stolberg line? What is it called? A line of concrete barriers.
The pillboxes?
Pillbox, no, not pillbox, the concrete barriers to prevent our tanks from getting through.
Okay.
The Siegfried line.
Okay.
We got as far as the Siegfried line where we had to get off the trucks, was as far as they could go. That first night.
Could you put us in time perspective now? Where are you? Are you still in 1944?
This is all, everything happened to me in 1944.
Okay.
So this was our first stop. We got off. We had to spend the night. And we spent our little squad spent a night in a German pillbox, and we also all took turns at sentries. The next day, our object was to capture the city of Stolberg, an industrial town. So we had to start walking down a highway, which on one side had a big depression with a track in it, which I assume was for the trolleys to go back and forth into Stolberg. But on the left side was a whole bunch of woods. So our squad was told to get into the woods. And we spent the night there just sleeping there. The next day, this was September 18th, 1944. The captain came and gave us all what they call rectangular bags full of explosives. There's a name for them, which I can't think at this point. Because straight ahead of us in a depression was a German pillbox. Our job was to go blow it up. As we got close to it, the squad leader named, I forgot his first name, was Sergeant Allen, I can't remember his first name, said we better get back because the German soldiers were outside the pillbox, and we better not try to blow it up when they're outside seeing us. So as we backed up a little bit, back into the woods, somebody screamed and said, Sergeant Allen was just shot. Will someone go back and find the medics? So I volunteered. I got myself back out of the woods by going all the way in and then going across and into that little depression where the tracks were. As I got up, and I said, I don't know who was, maybe God was with us. An American Jeep was coming down the road at the same time as I hailed them. And at first they didn't know who I was, they picked up their rifles at me, and I told them what happened. They got me into the Jeep. We went down the road into an old house where we found the medics. At this time, this is now November 18th, 1944, late in the afternoon, and it gets dark very, very rapidly. The medic said, "Sir," or whatever they wanted to call me, "we cannot go back with you at this point. It's pitch black. No lights are permitted." And so I slept on the floor of the parish at the medics that night. And the next morning, I went back to try to find my group. I went across the road, wherever it was, I don't even know, into the depression, back into the woods, looking around for my group. Unfortunately, I was walking down a little path then and stepped on an anti-personnel mine with my right foot. The mine blew me up, blew me way back onto my back, and a big piece of shrapnel went through my right leg. Some piece went through my, a little bit hit my left leg, and a piece went right through my hand here. And you can still see the finger all busted and the scars are still here, but that's it. So from that point on, since I was just left the medics, I yelled for the medics as I was right across from them, and they came out. They saw me, and they gave me a couple of shots of morphine, put me on a Jeep, and took me back to the battalion aid station. There, the doctors there went around and looked at everyone, and they gave you a little tag. So I had a tag on me, and from there I went on a hospital train to Paris, to the hospital of Paris, where they took out some of the shrapnel. And unfortunately, then I could not, my right hand wasn't a cast or bandages, I can't remember. And because I wanted to write a letter home, I would not dare write it to my parents because I know my mother would just blow up. But I did have an uncle in Washington, who was a PhD in chemistry, working for the National Board of Health, the Health Department, so that he would at least know what happened to me in case I never got home. From Paris, we went on a train to the English Channel onto a boat, across the English Channel to get the city in England. Another hospital train all the way up to a small little village called Warrington, outside of Liverpool. And there was a series of Quonset huts, and our heat came from a pit pot Betty stove. And I was there for a couple of weeks or so. And then in another train or truck, I can't remember, went to Liverpool. I got on a hospital ship with a big marking of Red Cross on it. And because the Northern Atlantic was full of submarines, this hospital ship them took a long way to get to the United States, to get out of the submarine lanes, and went all the way down past the coast of Spain, back a little bit into Africa, and then crossed at that point. And it took a very long trip, and we landed in Charleston, South Carolina.
How long a trip on?
Oh God, it seemed like it must have been 2 or 3 weeks. It was just so long.
Now, what was the major wound you were being treated for at this point?
My right foot and my right leg, which is the reason my right foot is all twisted, but that's another story. When we landed, I got on a hospital train the Army then had specialized hospitals. So I was sent to a hospital, which is outside of Indianapolis, called the Wakeman General Hospital, which specialized in neurological and plastic surgery cases. From the time I stepped on the mine till the time I got my discharge was about almost exactly 1 year. There they treated me at physiotherapy, and since we didn't have the prosthesis that they have today, for for my legs because I could hardly walk. They made me a special share of high boots, and around the ankles they had springs. So as I walked with crutches, my feet would automatically move up and down. So I could walk with the crutches and these special prosthesis boots with the springs. And that is the only way I was able to be mobile and get my physiotherapy and all of that. Then at that point in time, I got 1 week furlough to see my parents for the first time since I left them in 1943. But then I made a life-changing decision. I'm Jewish. There's a lot of anti-Semitism going on then. My real name is Daniel Krupnik, and I decided that if I am to get along in this new world that I want to go into, I better change my name to a name that was pretty much an Anglo-Saxon name.
Were you still in the service at that time?
I was still in the service. Still in the service. I went to a telephone directory, and believe it or not, I picked out the name Roberts because it was a famous movie with Henry Fonda. His name was Roberts, so I picked Roberts. And so I wanted to be sure that my discharge papers had my new name, and my new name then became Daniel Kenneth Roberts. I took the K for my previous name, which was Krupnik. So I'm on the Army records. I am Daniel Kenneth Roberts, and that's the way it is.
And when did you actually get discharged?
When I got discharged in November of 1945. I think it's 45.
And where were you when the war ended?
When the war ended, either I was still getting in the hospital. I think I was still in the war ended. I can't even remember the date. Was it?
I think it was May 45, right? The
May 45.
European.
So the European war must have ended. They were all going to Japan, but I was still in the hospital then until November or so of 1945. But one of my dreams was always going to Cornell University to study engineering. I applied for admission, and I was admitted. And I also had another life-changing decision that I made. I was very shy as a kid, but I decided that I wanted to develop a great deal of self-confidence, if possible, and some leadership ability. So I studied engineering, and I got into the engineering honorary society called Tau Beta Pi. And then in my spare time, I then joined many organizations. At Cornell, I was an announcer at the radio station. I worked for the Cornell Engineer, the magazine. And then there was since about 75% of the students, they were veterans. And since I was not a rah-rah fraternity guy, I joined an organization called the Independent Council, which then became the largest organization at the university. And I became president of the Independent Council and was admitted to another major honorary society there called Quill and Dagger, whatever. But I was admitted to both honorary societies. When I graduated Cornell with honors, the job market wasn't very, very good. I met my wife Betty, or Betty Roberts now. Her name was Betty Rosenberger at Cornell. We got married in 1951. And because I also want to continue on to get an MBA. By the way, I was first interviewed at Harvard, where I was qualified. And believe it or not, the first person I saw there says, "Boy, you're terrific, no problem." But when I went to see the second person for the interview, he didn't open my files, and this is what really, I don't want to use some bad language. Didn't open my files, and all he did was ask me questions like, where did your parents come from? Tell me where you lived. Tell me the kind of friends you had, how you spent your days, what he was saying. And of course, at that point, I was too naive to ask the question was, you're Jewish, get the hell out of here. As Harvard was discriminatory in those days. So instead, we got married and lived in Stuyvesant Town. Betty worked.
Did you get your MBA?
And then I went at night and got an MBA at New Graduate School of Business of New York University, which was downtown. My MBA was in marketing and management. My first job was as a draftsman through one of Betty's family's friends got me the job. I was a draftsman in a very small heating and ventilating air conditioning contractor.
Yeah, where were you living at this time? Post-war and post-college, where were you living?
In Stuyvesant Town.
Oh, okay.
In Stuyvesant Town I was living. I got my MBA at night in marketing and management. And I worked as a draftsman during the day, $50 a week. I don't recall how long I would work there, but then I got another job for a 50% increase. That's $75 a week with one of the largest mechanical contractors in New York City. Also a Carrier dealer, Carrier air conditioning. So I started with them in the drafting department, then moved into the engineering department, but then I moved into sales. I became a sales engineer on straight commission, no salary. I did very, very well. I worked there for 12 years, right? And my wife wanted to go back to Long Island, moved to Long Island, and bought a little house for $16,250 behind the gas station. And that's where my son was born. And then as I continued to do my job as a sales engineer, I did very, very well. I sold some of the very large contracts, especially in the new and old office buildings, which had to be converted. But without going into a lot of detail, I was very successful at it. But then at the age of 40, I said I want to change my career. And so what I did, I went to New York University, which was downtown, had a special psychological aptitude center, what considered very good. I went there and I said, can you tell me what my aptitudes are at the age of 40? And what occupations I would be most successful at. And I went through a series of tests, and the occupations, there were several. The one I should stay away from was accounting, which I hated anyway. And the one that was there at the top of the list was human resources. Terrific, because that was my experience at Cornell. And then at that point in time, I was still working there in human resources, and then I happened to see a small ad from a new organization called Robert Half, who was specialized personnel agency in the field of accounting and finance only. Later on, went into data processing as that became into the marketplace. And so I bought a franchise, and it was right at the beginning. Maybe there were 2 or 3 others, one in California, one in Chicago, I think. I looked around and I decided, I wanted to say, where shall I go? I drove around, I found Stamford, Connecticut. As I looked around, I said, Stamford is where I want to be because it was beautiful with lakes and everything else. I drove up north here. So we moved to Stamford. At that point in time, however, I was also president of the Reformed Jewish congregation in Merrick, Long Island. And so I had to resign from that. because we wanted my kids to sort of continue their schooling at the beginning of the school year here. So it's the beginning of July 1960. I'm losing my track of time. 1960, in July of 1967, we moved to Stamford. I opened a tiny office in downtown Stamford, big enough for 3 closets and an interview room. And then I kept it growing, and without going into a lot of details, certain circumstances happened because my franchise was for all of Westchester and Connecticut. My dear friend in Boston, who got very, very mad, I was told, because he thought half of Connecticut was his. Bob Half, one of the finest gentlemen you want to meet, was very apologetic for that. So I started looking for another office. I was searching up in Rochester, New York, and then found out that his son-in-law's brother wanted to open up an office. So as a consequence, without going into a lot of detail, for no charge or nothing, I got the franchise rights for the whole country of Canada, and opened the first office in Toronto and did my research. I got a fantastic person to run the office, and it did very, very well. And then I was called by Robert Half and say, hey, the Chicago office is up for sale. And without going into detail with my competition and wanted it to, I was able to buy the Chicago office for $10,000. Of course, the fellow who ran it was a drunk and failed completely. And so I said, what's the best way to make this proposition? I said, would you like an income for life? $10,000 as an income for life as a royalty. He took that, I bought it for $10,000, and within $3 he died. In about 3 years he died, because that was, that was his health problem, without the detail. And so I had a number of Robert Half offices with branches, probably about 15 locations. Here in Stamford, I found another wonderful, terrific, superb, qualified person. And each one who ran these offices, I had to do psychological testing, and he got the top grades in it. So he ran my offices. So we had 3 offices in Stamford, and we had Stamford, then we got White Plains, and of course another small town.
Yeah. Over what period of time is this Robert Half involvement?
I was with Robert Half for 26 years, and there were over 100 offices throughout the country. And one day Robert Half got a call from the head of our San Francisco office that says, I have some fellas here who are interested in buying out the company. All of us would say, how else could we ever retire? How do you sell an office? So Robert Half sold out his franchise as a franchisor, sold out his offices, and then over time I sold out my offices because I got this structure. My wife and I, because of the law at that point in time, and my wonderful, smart accountant, financial advisor named Eddie Backer, who was still my accountant for over 45 years, suggested that I sell the offices. But when they first approached me to buy my offices, I said, what do I have to sell for? I'm getting a royalty all the time. But under the law at that time, my wife and I were able to set up a separate company, and it was called Kenneth Management. I picked the word Kenneth because it's C-A-N for Canada, U.S. for United States. So I opened up a consulting business called Kenneth Management Associates. And that is the one that owned all these other offices. And we sold out over time The first offices were sold in the end of 1988, because when they approached me, I said, you know, there's no point in my selling. I get a good income this way. So eventually they proposed, make good proposals, and I sold a few offices at a time. From 1988 till about 1993, I think it was. Then we sold the offices here in Connecticut, and I was retired completely. And Betty, my dear wife, who also graduated Cornell, knew that I always had the dream of building my own home. Our first house that we built, our house in Connecticut, in Long Island, cost $16,250 behind the gasoline station. When he heard I wanted to sell it, he grabbed the house from me. Then we bought a house. Our first house here in Stamford was, I forget, something around $40,000, but there was no income tax. So on a net basis, it didn't cost me any more to move here. Our price that was higher than it was in Long Island, where I didn't pay the taxes to the state. So we bought our first house here in Stamford, and then he eventually moved to a second house. And while I was there, decided to build a house that I always dreamt about, and that's where we'll be living now. I built our house in what year? I can't remember. Living there over 24 years today.
Sounds like you've been in Stamford about 50 years now?
45 years or something like that, from 1960. We moved up here in 1967, I believe, or 66. Yeah, 1967 we moved to Stamford. And my daughter also was born in Long Island, so our whole family was raised here.
So let me ask you a question here, going back to the military service.
Yes.
Did you go through a period of flashbacks at all, your times over there into combat and so forth?
The flashback I have was stepping on that mine, which I'll never forget what happened. Every soldier on his belt had a little packet of what they call sulfonilamide powder. And the first thing I thought about with my mind was they open it up and pour it wherever I saw any wounds. I do recall that I was thrown way over on my back. That's why I have back problems today. I have steel rods in my back, but that's another story. I looked back and I saw this black little hole. I said, well, that's right. That was, in a way, I was extremely lucky. I do have on my wall at home, I have a diagram of the mine. And the mines, the anti-personnel mines, were made out of some kind of wood. And I would get taking a guess and say maybe they were 8 inches, a rectangle, maybe 8 inches square, and had the explosive in it and a plunger. These were designed to be buried under the dirt so you couldn't see them. So apparently my best judgment is I stepped on the edge of the mine. If my whole foot had gone like this, I would not be here talking to you today. But I must have stepped on the edge of the mine. That's the only way I could think of it. And I was thrown back. And I thought about the sulfonilamide, then I crawled back across the woods. You know, I told you the story where I yelled for the medics, they got me, and a long story from there. So bring it right up to today. We're living in our house now that I built without a general contractor. It's on a little lake, and it's beautiful. It's all of one story with a couple of bedrooms upstairs. I have my own office with my computer, and my copier, and my fax machine, and all my files are very well structured with indexes, so I can find practically anything that I need. And
Well, you have a pretty good recollection of the past and so
Yeah.
forth and so on.
Sure.
And you're a philosophical kind of guy, we know. And how would you look back? How did the military affect your thinking, you know, thereafter, and also how you see the world outlook today?
well, my thinking there, as I was very, very angry, and I have written a lot of notes which my dad had found and typed up into several pages of notes. However, I was angry because I wanted to be in the Air Force. I studied in aeronautical engineering, and I never got that far. And I wrote a very angry letter at the age of 18 or 19 then, because I had interviews, but no one there had to ask me anything about my education. And so where I wound up, I wound up at the infantry. I stepped out of mine, went to Cornell, got married, moved to New York, got an MBA, and did very well. Moved up into sales engineering, changed my whole occupations with Robert Half, one of the most wonderful, brilliant men I knew. Sadly, he died at the age of 82 with Alzheimer's. And built the house of my dreams, as Betty said. And that's where I'm living today. Unfortunately, something happened to me about a year or so ago. Of course, I still wasn't walking perfectly, but I was able to drive a car on my right foot. But I was then in the house. I had a scooter, a triangular scooter from the VA, which was getting pretty. No, I didn't bought it for. I bought it for a company here in town. This was pretty bad, and so I upgraded it to a new modern scooter, which looked beautifully, went well, except it was unstable. And one day when I was in the bathroom, it fell on me completely. I called 911, the pilot picked me up. And at that point, although I didn't realize it, my neurologist says, you then hit spinal point number T8 on the spine, which is right at my waist. And as a result of that, I became completely paralyzed below my waist. Of course, I still get a lot of medications from the VA. And then over time, I had to get some other changes. In any event, the VA here in North Haven, Connecticut, did not have a particular kind of need. At home, my den became a hospital room. I got a beautiful hospital bed from the VA. It's very unique, which moves around a bit during the night. I have a commode, which sadly, this was the only way I could do my thing every day. I had to be home at a certain number of hours and go down a commode. And then because I needed a certain piece of equipment that they did not have in Stamford, actually we had the VA North Haven, they sent me to the VA in the Bronx, and I had to go through a series of medical examinations as required there, so I was in bed there for about 3 weeks. And then my wonderful doctor, who was having to be Chinese, it was difficult to understand him, says, the chair I was in, which was a power chair, said, that is not for you. You have to go to our wheelchair department and get something designed for your case. And that's what I'm sitting in here right now. This is a wonderful chair. I could raise it and lower it. I could go back and forth. I could tilt back and forth. It has all sorts of mechanisms on here that was made to order for me because they had to measure me and whatever. and in about 5 weeks, I got this chair.
Well, you know, you have a great story, you have
And
a
then my
very
foot is another story.
good outlook, and I think we're very lucky to have had this time with you and to get your story, a survivor and a prosperer. And thanks again for
And it's my
joining us
pleasure.
today.
It's my pleasure. And I wrote the story of my life. And the only sad part is that our division, the 104th Infantry Division, after the war, published their book. And in that book gave the story of all the battles, but on the back was a list of all those who had died. And that's when I found out that Sergeant Allen, that day that I ran back to get the medic, was killed. I didn't know that till I read it in the division book. But that's life.
End of chapter, huh?
End of chapter.
Okay, thank you again, Dan.
It's my pleasure.